From the Commonwealth of Kentucky, the land of flowing bourbon, rolling bluegrass, fast horses, and the small towns between, here is your host, the average American, Will Woods.
Here today with Ed Massey, served on Boone County Board of Education for 22 years, prominent local attorney. Ed, let's start off. Tell us who you are.
I'm Charles Ed Massey. I go by Ed Massey. I grew up here in northern Kentucky, was born in Covington, grew up in Erlanger. After I was married, I moved to Hebron and live in Boone County, and that's where I've resided since 1995.
As an attorney, what type of law do you practice? What do you focus on?
I do anything that involves court, so any kind of trial work. It could be anything from military work, court-martial defense, to criminal defense, to personal injury, workers' compensation, anything involving the court process.
What are some of the most public cases you've tried locally?
So I've had some things over the past that were really interesting. I had a slip and fall case with PetSmart in Florence that was really unique. A client of mine had gone into the store and fallen on dog feces because they allow the dogs to go in with the owners. Of course, I filed a claim for her injury. She had a significant injury. And the judge threw it out, said there was summary judgment, there was no genuine issue of material fact, she should have seen it, et cetera, et cetera. I went on to appeal that case, and the Court of Appeals unanimously overturned it and published it, and therefore kind of changed the slip and fall law in Kentucky. What happened is it used to be that if it was an open and obvious danger, and you didn't see it, you couldn't get any kind of a claim. But in this case, I argued that you can't look for the feces on the floor if they're hanging their advertisements from the ceiling. And the court agreed with that. And now they changed the duty to the business has a duty to its invitees to make sure that the floor is safe and it's okay for invitees to come and ingress and egress out of the store. So that was a unique case. It was early on. I've been involved I was involved in the Grant County jail case where a young man was molested in the jail. I represented one of the jailers, and we went to federal trial. That did not turn out like I expected. He received essentially a 14-year sentence for nodding his head, and that's a long story, but that's the truth. We appealed to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, who argued that the judge had abused his discretion, but it was harmless error. And he wound up serving 14 years because somebody was going to take the fall for what happened to that young man in the Grant County jail case. In addition to that, I've done a variety of bankruptcy trials. I've done domestic trials, et cetera, et cetera. Some of the most fun cases I've had were in the military, involving some really extreme cases, everything from homicide to sex abuse. So I've had a very interesting career. I think what I would sum it up as is I would be bored if I had to do the same type of case every day, day in, day out, day after day. I have something new every day. So there's a lot of interesting things that come across my desk, and I really enjoy that mental challenge to be creative and to provide a defense or to provide a solution to a legal problem.
Can you tell us about your time on the school board in Boone County? You served 22 years. You also were a substitute teacher for 5 years. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so when I was in college, my dad, who just recently passed, was an administrator. My mother's a retired teacher, and my dad had always taught me there's two things nobody can take away from you. A, your faith in Christ, and B, your education. So I delved into that field because I followed what my parents had done, and I really enjoyed it. In fact, when I was in law school, I was considering doing not only getting a law degree, but getting an education degree and going into the classroom. Something happened in 1992, 93 that changed all of that for me. My dad was embroiled in a litigation matter where two of his former employees had filed charges against him. My first case out of law school with my mentors, Phil Tolliver and Bob Karen, was defending my dad in a 12 or 14 hour preliminary hearing in Boone County. Was thrown out for lack of probable cause. I went on to do the administrative side of that case with Phil and Bob, and it came out well for my father, who could have brought his own claims against the county or against people in the county, but elected not to do that, put it behind him. I learned at that point that I could have as much impact in education as a lawyer that I could as a teacher, if not more. And so in 1996, I ran for the school board, was elected. And one of the most proud things I will say about that is the Boone County Education Association had a supported opponent against me. I prevailed. And that never let that bother me. And then the next election cycle, they actually endorsed me. And because I believe that if people come together and sit down and talk through their differences, come up with a solution, there are ways to manage the problems. And so I became a board member, and then I got involved with the Kentucky School Boards Association. I think it was 2007 and 2008. I became the president of the Kentucky School Boards Association. And then I ultimately became the president of the National School Boards Association in 2012. Part of that pathway, too, that's interesting is in 2004, I ran for state representative for the first time, and I lost to Adia Wuchner, and I lost by a small margin of votes. I stayed involved. I've been a Republican my entire career. When I registered as a Republican, my first election was involving Ronald Reagan, which I voted for, and never been anything but a Republican. And I ran and lost in a primary. And so, but that was fortuitous. At that time, I ran for the wrong reasons. I ran because I wanted the position. I wanted the rung on the ladder. I wanted to move up the ladder, et cetera, et cetera. But it wasn't the time for me. I wasn't prepared. I wasn't ready. And I went on to do those roles in the school board world. And that actually prepared me for when I did run for legislative office again in 2018. And then I was ready, and I wasn't running for just me. I was running because I felt I could make a difference in my community.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about your first term as a state representative, what you found challenging about the role, some of your successes, and what you would do if you had another term in the State House.
So when I was elected initially, I really didn't know what to think. I've always been a person that voiced my opinion. I've been very transparent. Even though it wasn't normally in line with the Republican Party, I've always been a supporter of public education. And of course, that's been a development over the last few years that ultimately probably led to my removal from the legislature. But candidly, I walked in there with open eyes and an ability to listen. Because I've been a lawyer for so many years, I knew how to work things through the process. I knew how to work things through the system. It didn't bother me to get up and stand in front of people and make arguments or state positions. And so that was a natural fit for me. And when I was first in the House, one of the first things I did was to call for a meeting with the Speaker, David Osborne. We went and sat down, and I told him I'm totally open to work with the party, to work with you. Tell me where you need me, how can I help, et cetera, et cetera. I have been made vice chair of judiciary from the moment I was elected, and they started creating committee positions. So I served with Jason Petrie for my first 2 years as vice chair of judiciary. And then after 2 years, Representative Petrie moved on to be the chair of A&R, and I then was offered the position of chairman of judiciary. And so I really enjoyed that. It was a natural fit for my legal career, but I was still involved in educational matters. I also served on the education committee. And so it was, to me, the perfect merger of the things that I've been involved in, which is education and law. And I really enjoyed that process. And I was fortunate to have several bills passed in my 4 years. My first term, I had a bill passed that allowed us to open Ignite Institute in Boone County. There was some bureaucratic red tape that was going to prohibit that. We were able to get it at the last minute, get something through the floor of the House, pass it through the Senate, and allowed Ignite to open. And then from there on, I began to bring other bills forward. I knew how to work them through the system to gain comprehensive support. In fact, we did a teacher bill, a retirement pension bill, that after the uprisings that had happened a couple of years earlier with all the protests in Frankfurt under then Governor Bevin, we were able to sit down at a table with both sides of both parties, the School Board Association, the Teachers Union, everyone, and come up with a bill that had bipartisan support that created a new tier for teachers that was fully funded. Because one of the big issues is that the retirement pension system wasn't fully funded.
Right.
And it saved Kentucky millions upon millions of dollars. And so I'm very proud of that bill, not because I did it, but because of relationships, brought all these people together around the table. And in a very civil context, we sat down, agreed what we could agree on, discarded what we could not agree on, and came up with an effective solution for education. So that's the way I believe legislation should be done. When I lost in 2022, I was very supportive. I'm not against charter schools. I'm not against public schools. I am against redirecting money away from the public schools to fund those schools because Kentucky's Constitution requires us to provide an appropriate, free, and appropriate education to all students, and it has to be equitably and adequately funded.
Right.
And so until that level is reached, I don't think we should then digress and move money to other locations. If the legislature wants to separately fund it, that's a different story.
Right.
But if they're going to take money away from public schools that are striving to meet the directives of state and federal government, I think that was a problem. So I stood strong in that, voted against the charter school bill, the voucher bill, et cetera. The local authorities here in the party were not fond of that, and so they targeted me for the election. But it wasn't just me; it was my colleagues that were also in the House, Sal Santoro and Adam Koenig. We were all chairs, and what the people in Northern Kentucky didn't realize is that for years, Northern Kentucky really hadn't had a seat at the table, and for the first time, we had 5 chairs of committees. And so bills in committee are selected usually by the chairs and then approved by the leadership. And we had a big voice in Kentucky. And in 2022, in one election, they eliminated 3 chairs, and in many ways eliminated the voice that Northern Kentucky had.
Well, I was going to say, it seems to me like we don't have a voice at this point. The only voice that Northern Kentucky has in Frankfurt right now is trying to get Kentucky 18 named after President Trump. That seems to be his focus, seems to be the focus that we want to make Kentucky public schools take away their gun-free zone status. We want to allow 18-year-olds to carry handguns. You know, in your experience as a trial lawyer, especially when it comes to wrongful death cases or homicide cases, do you see, one, that legislation passing? But if it were to pass, do you feel that the homicide rate would increase in the area?
I think it could. What I would say is before I was even elected, while I was a school board member, there was a major push to allow teachers that had concealed and carry permits to carry in the classroom. And one of the biggest board meetings we ever had involved that very issue. Again, I didn't try to just attack it on my own accord. I sat down. I didn't say, hell no, we're not going to do this. I said, let's gather all the people that have a knowledge about this. So we had the Kentucky Center for School Safety. We had the insurance company that represented the district. We had teachers. We had administrators. We had law enforcement. We had all kinds of people, and we took that input. And at the end of the day, the board decided unanimously that we were not going to allow that. The biggest reason is people that have a concealed carry permit are not thoroughly trained in firearms. And if you take a teacher that is trying to monitor, 15 or 20 kids and has distractions all day long, there might be a bigger danger of a student coming into contact with a firearm and either injuring someone else or themselves. And also, if there was a shootout in a school, teachers that were not trained like law enforcement officers would have tunnel vision and could wind up harming children as well as any adults that were in the class. So we decided that that was in the best interest of the schools, and it's remained that way to today, even though we have open carry now. I'm not against guns. I'm a full supporter of guns. I've been a member of the NRA, still a member of the NRA. I hunt. I love to shoot. I possess many firearms. I've had a concealed and carry permit, I think, since it came out, and I still maintain it, even though we have open carry in Kentucky today. So I believe in that process. I do believe in the right to keep and bear arms. However, I also believe that teachers, when they're employed, were employed as teachers, not to be security guards, not to be enforcement personnel for the school. That's why our district in Boone County was the first to install school resource officers into the school programming. I'll never forget, Michael Helmig, sheriff at that time, came to me and asked me about it. And initially, I was young at that point and didn't know a lot. And so at that point, I said, well, I don't know about them carrying firearms. And Michael said something to me I never forgot. He said, look, we're professionals. This is a tool that we use in the context of our job, and we could not do this job without our tools. And I thought about that a lot. And it made sense to me because they're well trained. They have to go through classes. They have to recertify. They're law enforcement officers. They go through training drills. And so we decided that was a good move for Boone County to allow law enforcement officers to be in our schools. And they actually worked out beautifully. And so now in Boone County, there's a law enforcement officer, school resource officer in every school in the county. And so it again, through knowledge, experience, interaction, talking with people, we did what I feel is very appropriate. And I think it's our duty. I think our most valuable resource is our children. And so we have to do what we can to protect them and provide them with an opportunity for a solid education so that they can be our future.
Two things that I want to bring up before we hit the first break. One, you mentioned school security. There has been a plan floated before to install security guards, metal detectors at every school. It could be covered with approximately $25 million per year after the initial $200 million investment. Why is it that the legislature, not just in Kentucky, but in other states, won't act to provide school systems the same security we provide concert arenas, sporting venues, federal buildings? Why do we not do that?
Well, I think that the truth lies in the fact that we could also build cars that no one would die in if there was a vehicle accident. But the cost of a vehicle like that would be so exponentially large, it would be cost prohibitive. We could make our buildings hardened with bulletproof glass, with security details. But if there's any break in the links or the fence, then it still allows somebody to come in and do the damage they've done. It's not that we wouldn't want to do that. I think it's almost cost prohibitive to the taxpayers. And I don't think the taxpayers would be willing to foot the bill for that kind of level of security. We didn't want to create compounds or detention centers to house our kids in. So I think that we need to look at what we do and build it as a stair-step model. You know, I laughingly say when I was in high school, I was a deer hunter. My dad bought the first deer rifle that I ever had from a student at Connor High School on school property, because kids in that day would bring guns to school and go hunting after school. Our world has changed, and because our world has changed, we've had to adapt to it. But I think you can either be proactive or reactive, and I think being reactive is always not the best answer.
Right.
I think one of the things we really need help with is a lot of the people that have done these dire deeds in our schools, have committed atrocities in our schools. There were mental health issues. There were things that other resources that should have been provided, bullying that was going on in schools. And so I think in addition to securing or hardening the targets of schools, we've really got to look at providing resources to students and families that are in distress, whether that's poverty, whether that's medical distress, whether it's anxiety. You know, when I went to school, most kids had a mom and dad, and mom stayed home, and you went to school and you know, somebody was there when you got home from school. Today, we have a lot of single parent families that are struggling to make it. When the kids go home from school, no one's there. They are hanging out with friends or gangs or whatever the case may be, and they're not getting the support and the resources they need, but they want to fit in. And so through that process, we've had a lot more violence in our schools. I remember back when I think it was 1995 when a young man killed his entire family and took a class hostage at Ryle High School. That was actually one of the first violent acts in school in our country. The reason it didn't get the notoriety, thank God, is because no one in the school died as a result of a administrator that was able to talk the young man out of his firearm in the class. But then we had, Columbine, and we've had Parkland, and we've had all these other atrocities that have happened. And I think parents are saying, hey, if I'm going to take my kid to school, I want to make sure they're safe. And I agree with that. I agree. But we can't just forego other resources to just harden our schools and make them defensive compounds. Or we can't just arm every teacher because they're not in a role. I had one superintendent say, I thought it was hilarious. He said, my teachers can't keep up with their keys. How are they going to keep up with their firearms? And that wasn't a complaint or criticism of the teachers. It wasn't. It just means that a school teacher in the context of a day has so many responsibilities and so many little ones, or even at high school age, so many persons they're looking out for that they can't possibly be a security guard full-time as well as be a school teacher. So I think it's a problem that we need to bring both sides to the table. The problem right now in politics is that the sides don't even talk to one another. They want to throw mud and sling mud at all times. If you can agree on 99 things, but if you disagree on one, they're going to come after you. And we've lost our ability to have informed, knowledgeable, constructive conversation trying to work out what's in the best interest of our communities.
You brought up former Sheriff Mike Helmig's instituting school resource officers within Boone County Schools. Recently retired due to health reasons after a lengthy career. What do you think his legacy will be as sheriff, and how do you feel Boone County has benefited from his leadership?
Oh, I think Mike has done a tremendous job. I first met Mike. He was an assistant. He was a sheriff working in the schools. With my dad, they instituted dog searches at Connor High School for drugs, and they were working on getting drugs out of the schools. He elevated himself to sheriff. He worked very diligently on the merger between the county police and the Boone County Sheriff's Department. Boone County Sheriff's Department not only became a local icon, but it became a national icon. It's a place that was the example of what a sheriff's department should be like. So it's grown enormously over that period of time. It's had its problems. Any business, any agency has its issues, but at all times, Mike was able, through that leadership, to keep good people on staff, to have a good reputation, not only in the community, but in the country, and provided safety and security to the community members of Boone County. And it was still very personable. I could still call up somebody at the sheriff's department and ask them, if I was going to be out of town, would you mind having a patrol car drive by and look out for my property? And they would do that every single time. So I think that there was just hard work. I think there was expectations that Mike established. And I think that will go down as a wonderful career, a wonderful legacy of allowing Boone County, which was one of the fastest growing counties in the country, to do what it did, to grow, to have a good education system, to have businesses. And I think that takes a team effort. And Mike, certainly as the sheriff, was a primary instrument in that process. Moving
forward, Mike Helmig's right-hand man, Les Hill, is now the sheriff of Boone County. What do you foresee in his tenure?
I think you'll see the transition will be natural is what I think. I think if you would have had somebody else come in, it could have been disruptive because they would have had a different leadership style. Anybody that's familiar with how Boone County works know that Les and Mike worked hand in hand. And even for the last several years, as Mike was suffering with his Parkinson's diagnosis, they were hand in hand. You would see, if you saw Mike, you saw Les. If you saw Les, you would see Mike. And so I think there's going to be very little upheaval in the transition process. Now, I don't know how long Les will want to keep that job, or I'm sure he'll probably at least run for an additional term. But I think the idea is that we want to have less upheaval and more consistency. My experience has been consistency over time typically pays off very well, not only in law enforcement, also in schools. Going back to what I said about the school district, for about 12 to 15 years, we had a very connected Board of Education. and we were the liaison between the community and the administrative officers of Boone County Schools. And that consistency over time allowed us to build a very robust educational system for our community. And so what happened is we not only became a local solid proponent for education, but we became a state and national model for education. And because of that, it was because people working together, consistency over time, sharing the same view. When there's upheaval or division within an agency, that's where things become disruptive, and usually the people that are receiving the services are the ones that suffer.
Talking with attorney and former state representative Ed Massey. We'll be right back.